that's probably quite a long-winded overview. I don't know, from looking at it from your side, how you guys are seeing it.
Do you want to answer that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's interesting that the action that the Kuwait Pension Fund took, because obviously, if you're in the position of a not a small creditor but not a secured creditor, then it's very tempting to take very quick, aggressive action to try and be the nuisance that gets paid off. The difficulty is that actually that's not necessarily in the best interests of everyone, and you might be better off just on looking at a restructuring.
Yeah, I think maybe I'm a transaction lawyer and not a litigator, but I always think stabilizing companies always works better. I'm also a U.S. attorney, and I've seen a lot of Chapter 11's work where if you allow company to stabilize and get the money and start doing the business, get the bad assets out, it almost always works. I mean, and something that is very relevant is what happened to Our Capita. Our Capita is a regional company who did a Chapter 11 in the US. And now pretty much everybody's talking about the new Our Capita, which is the company with the new assets, which is doing new business, because it was allowed to get out of its bad debt. Because of the Chapter 11, it was allowed to recover rather than just like this mad sell of assets where people weren't able to recover money. So I think restructuring, and I agree with you, stabilization of the company in abroad is very, very interesting and has to happen. There are obviously the two ways for stabilization to come. One is almost like contractual and consensual, and the other is you have the ability for the regulator to step in, because the DFSA law actually allows the regulator to step in and say, hey, we are going to change the manager.
Right. Well, similarly in Cayman, that is what would happen as well, because the minute the petition is going to be filed, the regulator has to be served as well. And in that situation, the regulator, which is Cayman Islands Monetary Authority, CIMA, can appear at the hearing, can actually put in their own submissions in terms of their regulatory concerns and how they believe the assets should be preserved. And to ensure nothing is dissipated in the interim, can also advise in terms of any seizures that need to be made or freezing that need to be done. And in addition to that, can even apply for the provisional liquidation status to be put into place, which is what effectively works like the Chapter 11 or UK type administrative order. In that, within that space of time, they expect to see a scheme of arrangement or at least some workout being done. And CIMA can actually attend those meetings as well to see. They don't have voting rights, but can see how the voting is being done and to assess whether there's actually any meaningful arrangement that's going to be made that actually protects investors and creditors. So from that standpoint, I think that's where the regulator really should step in. Unfortunately, sometimes there's not an appetite to get in the middle of what they consider commercial disputes. So until that point where they've truly assessed to say, well, and stepping back as one who was legal counsel, when you put forward a submission to the board to say, yes, this is one we need to step in on, it largely depends on whether they think the direction and management was such bad conduct or almost equated to fraud to decide to jump in, or there were so many regulatory concerns that out of non-embarrassment, you need to step up and say, well, you haven't filed any audited, you've misappropriated assets, you've done a number of things, including not having fit and proper management, and the combination of things would then prompt the regulator to jump in.
Do you think that knowing how long the Al Ghassabi case took and having this case so recently after it, do you think that makes it more likely that they're going to step in this instance?
I'm not sure. Maybe if I was behind the scenes, perhaps if behind the scenes a lot more of the creditors were making complaints directly to the regulator, it would prompt them to step in a lot quicker. But again, the appetite is not there if it's going to be long-winded and there isn't the resources to continually follow up on a matter like that. The most they probably do is wait, because they can actually step in between the actual filing of the petition and the actual winding up hearing to say to the court, this needs to be properly court supervised. Here's who we would nominate as somebody to hold the fort, and then step back and wait for the reports.
And we've discussed there's a number of comparisons between Abraj and MF Global. Right. You've got a lot of knowledge about the MF Global case. Can you give us some details on MF Global and lessons learned from that case that could be learned in this case?
So MF Global is a US case. MF Global is a derivative and a commodity broker that was based in US, and in 2011 they were trading in a lot of sovereign debt, a lot of Europe debt, and also a lot of derivatives. They had funds. To cut the story short, sometime between October 2010 and October 2011, there was a lot of commingling of funds. There was about $700 million that is claimed that they took from the funds that was belonging to their investors and gave it to the fund, and about $150 million loan was given to its subsidiary in the UK. Accelerate 2 months, in October 2011, they filed for bankruptcy. And in November 2012, they were put into Chapter 11 and a trustee was appointed. Yesterday, or actually 2 days ago, a news story came out that the stakeholders, which are 26,000 stakeholders, have recovered $100 cents on each dollar. So they've made full recovery of everything that they invested in MF Global. And the way that has worked is there was a lot of transactions that were booked off balance sheet. There was money that was in accounts of various creditors, which was actually commingled with MF Global's own account money. And what the trustee in this case did was it allowed time to the lenders to actually go through the books and see when the money came in, whether the money was actually MF Global money. They traced various transactions and they were able to separate money. So now they have recovered, I think, $700 million from the UK subsidiary, which is going back, and about, if I'm not wrong, it was $300 million from JP Morgan that's going down, and there's a recovery from PwC accounting, which was done because of off-balance sheet to balance sheet that they've been able to recover. And that's the great story, and I think that goes back to the point that we were earlier making, that if you allow a business to actually stabilize and go through its assets in time rather than do fire sale of liquidation assets and get proceedings, it might take longer, or in Ahab's case, shorter, to actually get both the creditors and investors and stakeholders to the point where they can actually get their money back. I mean, yes, not every case is going to be MF Global where you're going to get 100 cents on a dollar, right? But if you can get 40 right now on Ahab, I'm sure everybody here will take it, right? Or even on Abraj, and that's the point. I mean, I think MF Global, there was a lot of commingling. The people were, and there are like actual trades. You have to actually find individual people for it. But both for creditors and investors has been great. And I think if there is any lesson that's come out of it, is that let the business restructure, let the business stabilize, give it time to get the money back.
There tends to be one key thing that's needed for that, and that's trust.
Correct.
And that tends to be the limiting factor in a restructure. Particularly when there's potential fraud or commingling, there's an incentive for one side not to give all the information. And that tends to mean that often people do need to take action to try and force something to happen. But my personal view is the starting position should always be that a consensual stabilization of it, with each side sort of coming in and realizing that you're not going to get everything you want. And that's pretty difficult in the region where a lot of, let's call them banks, creditors to a company where something like this has happened, they feel that they've been taken for a ride. They feel that the family has taken money out of this business and that's the reason, and they want either revenge or they want to see a pound of flesh from that side. And the family themselves often, or the company themselves, think, well, we've done nothing wrong. Why are you guys being like this? You gave us all the money, half the time we didn't even want it. And all those things trying to resolve can be very difficult, but it should be imperative for everyone to do so, because in the MF Global one, and there's others where if you do get that stabilization, a business can turn around and recover far more value than if nothing happens and it does go into a bankruptcy. Right. Particularly in the region with the new bankruptcy laws are great, but they're not used yet. And until they are and people see the sort of recoveries from it, most people are going to assume that it's going to be pretty difficult, take a long time, and the value you would get from it would be much lower than if you were to do a consensual restructuring. Even if it's not the ideal restructuring, it's definitely going to be more than going into a bankruptcy process.
I mean, and just even before the bankruptcy laws came into place, I mean, I've done enough restructurings, and sometimes there is actual fraud and commingling and disputes, but sometimes it's just because things happen and people react and they think it's a short term. I mean, let's be honest, we don't know what's happened in abroad. We've all read what's in the news, right? So those are allegations from one party to another. But I have seen businesses recover after restructuring in the region where they've been able to not only just pay creditors, but actually start doing new business. And I think that's important to do too. And in MF Global, the reason it worked is because Gibson, who's a very, very well-respected lawyer in US, was appointed as a trustee, and both sides trusted him. And again, that goes to the point. You have to have consensus, you have to have trust, but restructuring, in my view, works better than trying to kind of go after people. And you have to have all the stakeholders on board, and that's the other important bit, because sometimes secured creditors take the position that we are in the leading seat and they forget the other stakeholders. And when you have that kind of a situation, you almost find yourself not only the fact that the company is on one side and the stakeholders are on the other side, the stakeholders are fighting amongst themselves, and that makes restructuring almost impossible.
That's usually the case, particularly when the asset is not necessarily in the jurisdiction. And what you find is, just like with other schemes of arrangement, those that have 50% or more in numbers, or 75% in terms of the value, are the ones that make the push at all times. But I think that's why the Cayman courts kind of opened it up to say the unsecured creditor, as much as you're not precluded from taking any sort of action and bringing it to the fore on a simple basis that your statutory demand has not been met, whether it's $1 or 10 million. But the problem there is, once that inward fighting continues, there is still dissipation of assets in the meantime, and a payment out of a lot of debts and trying to have third-party issues dealt with. And that's, I think, what takes up a lot of the time as well, and why most then just say, court, make an order, please. Give me what I can get on it and go, and have the liquidator deal with it. From the trust issue standpoint, I think that's where it makes more sense to have a court-supervised situation, so that everybody agrees who the appointed one is. I've been in insolvency matters where the fight was actually not so much over the liquidation itself, but who is going to be the liquidator to be appointed. There were objections specifically on that, and conflicts of interest or a matter of trust because of previous dealings, or that their third party is being considered more than another. And worse, in the case with Al Said, it was because it was a family issue. So with that sort of inward fighting as well, who exactly is going to take the mantle? But then once the liquidation order is made, the directors have to step away. So somebody has to take it and run with it, and that person has to be someone who they trust.
Yeah, a point that I want to make is kind of from what you were saying, and it's kind of to do with the new Dubai bankruptcy law. And I know we're not discussing that, but it's important to bear in mind that Dubai bankruptcy law actually provides for those provisions as well. And I think we were having a discussion earlier with the advisor to the Minister of Finance, who was saying that they will have a list of trustees which the court would have to appoint from, which is a pretty big step. And they've also introduced Chapter 11 under Dubai bankruptcy law, and we'll be happy to talk about it later with anybody who's interested, or kind of reach out to us. And I know we're kind of focusing on this one, but that is important to bear in mind as to what's happening in this jurisdiction to develop those issues.
Yeah. I suppose that brings us on to the $100 million question, maybe even a bit more. If you're a creditor or investor in a barrage, what should you be doing now?
Well, if you're a creditor and investor in a barrage, I think you should be focusing on getting a steering committee together and having a discussion with the company. And the steering committee of creditors is already in place, and they've had a meeting. But as an investor, what you should be doing is you should be focusing on getting a seat on the table, because that's what happens. Investors get forgotten, and your unit holders get forgotten. So you need to have a stakeholder. You have to have a seat on the table, and you have to have a representation on the table, so that you are not forgotten. And you're not, and that is what I think, for investors' perspective, that's really important, because creditor, everybody's afraid of, and they're going to talk to. But investors need to kind of come together and find a way to be on that steering committee table. so that their interest is represented, because they are the ones who suffer the most in the project, and because they're equity positions, and if they are not represented, that gets difficult.
Yes. I would tend to agree with that statement. I mean, it comes down to just simply attending, making sure you have the opportunity to block or influence a particular vote, so that you can get the most on the dollar as a return on your investment. It's about showing that power to say, well, management, you didn't do what you're supposed to do, so here I am seated at the table expecting it to be done properly at the end of the day. What they also need to look at is that any of those transactions that would have taken place in the last 6 months prior to the filing of it are really considered void. So what really happens to the sort of negotiations that were there before, the promises that were made that there may be somebody who's coming to bail them out, and that typically is not necessarily going to be honored from the court perspective. So that's another point I think that investors and creditors really need to look at, and precisely how the money is being whittled away. I mean, the legal costs, as much as we like to be paid, is part of it. I mean, the liquidator is going to eat out of that. There are a number of ancillary applications, preliminary applications, and things that will start eating away at the assets from the very first day. So those are things that need to be looked at, and to ensure that once the auditors are going through, that they get proper books and records.
I probably add a couple of things to that, whether I was a creditor or an investor. I think participating in a consensual restructuring is important, and having that seat at the table. But I would also have my plan B going along to the side of it. And if I was an LP holder, that would be getting together with all the other LP holders and working out how do we get Abraj as either an LP or a GP out of this, because that contagion effect is significant, both in terms of the value, the confidence, etc., for your assets. And if they're not managing it properly, then there could be significant sort of diminution in value from their perspectives. And if I'm Arif Naqvi, given what people sort of know about how he's built it up and the successful way that he did, and the amazing success that Abraj had, is he really going to let go of that Abraj Holdings and that control in the short term? I think there's a lot of doubt about that. This has already gone on for, when did this come out? October? So we're still talking about 6-7 months, and there hasn't really been that much progress. So have your contingency plan. The same as with the creditors. It's, if you can't get movement quickly to get to a stable solution, then you've got to have that plan to take action and force that to happen. And generally within the legal documentation, whether it's the loans or others, there is the provision to be able to do that. But you as the creditors would need to work together, or you as the LPs would need to be able to work together to do that. So do go for a consensual plan, because that's probably the best way to get value, but have your contingency plan, because if that doesn't work or it drags on, then you need to be able to do something yourselves as well.
So I think I agree with that. I mean, as an investor group, you should be focused on getting together, getting either to the consensual position or to the position of whatever your strategy is, because there is number and value pretty much, right? So if you are working as a group, you're going to get a lot more if you're not working as a group. So definitely push for that.